When it comes to planning insecurity, knowledge is very important. Knowledge about who is the biggest. Who, for example, is the biggest foreign investor in Afghanistan? Which country has the most internet users? Which country is the biggest emitter of carbon gases? And which country has the most people in the world? There's one country that's all of these. Welcome to China.
China's growth has meant that it has expanded and needed to expand its interests around the world. Chinese projects and companies now operate on all 5 continents, but this expansion has not always gone smoothly.
We have several incidents in Africa, for example, Nigeria, Kenya, but also, for example, Zimbabwe, where Chinese investors were clearly threatened by political interest groups, but also by armed factions.
Yes, there have been kidnappings, there have been assassinations, there were Chinese ships hijacked or held for ransom.
And it's not just in Africa where there have been problems. Even in Pakistan, there have been attacks on Chinese interests.
We have seen contingencies, attacks on Chinese targets in Balochistan, in Waziristan, and even in the Pakistani capital. So it's quite serious.
So how is China reacting?
There have been unconfirmed reports in Africa that they have their own private security firms who may be defending pipelines or energy installations.
But the investment in Africa in particular has helped developing countries' development.
I've heard Jeffrey Sachs say that China seems to be more interested in developing Africa's infrastructure than the West ever was. They're building additional railways. They built railways in the 1950s and 60s, but now they're building roads, railways, football stadiums, government ministries. It's all part of the package.
It seems some of these benefits do not come without conditions.
If you look, for example, at the massive loans that China is throwing out at the African continent, well, the Chinese are very clever in recycle this money 3 or even 4 times. It's loan, it's not a grant. When it comes to using these loans, often they have to stick to Chinese contractors with Chinese workers and so forth. So even though there are no political strings attached, there are clearly economic strings attached.
But China could point to cases where there appears to be no ulterior motive in helping African countries. For example, in countries which have no natural resources.
A lot of observers say all the Chinese programs, mainly or only for resources. But the opposite is true. You know, Mali, which is a country, a lack of resources. The Chinese help the Mali people there built up the second bridge across the Niger River. We also help the Mali people build up the anti-malaria center and provide medical equipment and medicines for the local people to help them to make free treatment of the disease. You cannot see any resources for China to grab for the Chinese development.
But despite these positive outcomes, business is business.
China is not an NGO, and if you look at the views of Chinese experts, but also government officials on their economic cooperation, on the one hand they stress, okay, it's very important to show that we still have this South-South alliance, but on the other hand, the baseline is still we have to look after our own economic interests.
In addition, they claim that rather than a resources grab, Chinese companies are just involved in selling on the open market.
The Chinese company do business in Africa. For example, in Sudan, the Chinese oil company invests there heavily. But they sell the oil from Sudan to all the other markets in the world, not only return all the oil back to China for the development. Why? because those companies are market-oriented company. They have to make money.
Defending an expanding set of global Chinese interests could help China's army discover a new role.
Emerging economies like this discover that they have interests to protect, perceived threats to protect, and a status, a symbolic status to develop a strong military or security force.
Within the military elite, there is a lot of interest for finding new major tasks for the People's Liberation Army. Defending the borders continues to be very important, also maintaining domestic stability, but still there is a very interesting quest now for a kind of a new, as they call it, historical mission for the PLA. And non-traditional security threats certainly play an important role in that quest for new tasks.
Part of making its military more independent means China has moved away from buying its military hardware to making it itself.
Thus far, China has purchased most of its important military hardware from Russia, $2 billion each year, so it's quite significant. But they see it as a very strategic, long-term objective to have their own indigenous, independent military-industrial complex. You can already see everywhere that the Chinese are starting to export their military goods to other developing countries, so it's quite lucrative for them as well.
China has been regularly accused of underreporting its level of spending on its military.
China's official military spending is underrated. The figures are way too low, but that's of course not only the case with China. If you look at India, Russia, for example, you face the same problem.
The Brazilian defense minister a couple of years ago even went so far as to say that their defense budget has to increase by 50%. No one batted an eyelash.
From the Chinese point of view, the differences in figures come down to divergent ways of counting military expenditure.
They always exaggerate the Chinese military expenses. In recent years, we increased the amount of military expenses. But as I know, mostly the money used for the salaries and the living standard improvement. Well, that's big. China has more than 2 million soldiers. If one official or one common soldier just increased a little bit for their salary, the total will be very big.
The type of hardware has changed too, with defensive being joined by offensive projects.
We see nowadays that China is doing a lot of research and development in arms systems that are not that defensive. Its most recent generation of cruise missiles has a huge range. If we look at its most recent generation of anti-ship missiles, ranges until 200 kilometers. So I think these are all signals that China is gradually extending its traditional military range, and this is only the start.
China may be increasingly making its own military hardware, but is it any good?
I've heard military experts, as I say, indicate, for example, that the latest Chinese technology, the G10, is 1980s technology, basically. That the carrier may be a one-shot carrier.
China feels that far from being a threat, it already helped save the world economy during the financial crisis. China's holding of US government bonds accounts for about a third of the US stimulus package.
The US government already has a big budget deficit. It needed more money to do its stimulus package to stimulate the US economy recovery. So from this point of view, China invests its money in US market. It's for saving US. It is for saving the world economy as well.
The new approach of a more powerful, globalized China towards its foreign and security policy raises many questions. For example, will the frozen conflicts that it has be unfrozen by its build-up of military hardware? How will it merge its principle of non-interference with its need to protect its increasing number of investments abroad? Not many people have all the answers, but many agree that one thing is clear: this is a work still under construction.
In reality, it is widely recognised that China's leadership is more worried about internal problems and threats than external ones.
They have been aware that internal security issues are the most direct threat, the highest priority even. Internal insurgencies, terrorism, even crowd control. There are mass demonstrations on environmental issues. So they've become familiar with this concept of non-traditional security. They watch it very carefully. I've been involved in some of them actually, or in the midst of some of these mass public demonstrations.
Now the most difficult stage arrives, meaning making growth more balanced, making also growth more oriented towards generating new jobs, making growth cleaner. So all these challenges still lie ahead, and I think this definitely gives a lot of reasons for concern in Beijing.